The sun hadn't quite burned off the morning haze when the first vans rolled up to the historic theater on Wilshire Boulevard. Satellite dishes unfolded like mechanical flowers, cords snaked across the red carpet, and assistants in headsets scurried between lighting rigs and coffee carts. It was one of those Los Angeles days where glamour and chaos tangled together, polished heels clicking over loose cables, publicists whispering urgent corrections into walkie-talkies, and a dozen different live streams humming to life before the main event even began. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old velvet and fresh paint. The theater had been restored just for this premiere, its gilded ceiling gleaming under carefully placed spotlights. Rows of plush seats faced a modest stage where a single wooden chair sat waiting. No flashy backdrop, no giant logo, just a quiet space for someone who'd spent a lifetime avoiding fanfare, that someone was expected to arrive any minute now. Backstage, the mood was a mix of nervous energy and practiced calm. Crew members double-checked mic levels, while a makeup artist dabbed powder on a guest panelist's forehead. Everyone knew this wasn't just another press junket. The man they were waiting for didn't do many of these anymore. When he spoke, people listened, even if they didn't always agree. And lately, his comments about the state of movies had stirred more than a few debates online. Out in the audience, a young reporter adjusted her earpiece and glanced at her notes. She'd been assigned to cover the event for a national entertainment channel, and she'd come prepared with questions designed to cut through the usual PR fluff. She wasn't there to gush over legends. She wanted substance. Or at least, that's what she told herself. Truth was, she'd seen the clips, interviews where he'd said things like, "Movies used to mean something," or "You can't CGI a soul," and she'd rolled her eyes. Not out of malice, but out of habit. In her world, those kinds of statements were often code for, "I don't like what's new." And new was everything. She'd rehearsed her question in the car on the way over. Not to trap him exactly, but to test him, to see if the man behind the myth could hold his ground in today's media landscape, where hot takes spread faster than facts and nuance rarely made the headline. She believed in progress and innovation, in the idea that storytelling could evolve without losing its heart. But she also knew that belief sounded a lot like defensiveness when you said it out loud. Outside, a murmur rippled through the crowd gathered behind the barricades. A black sedan had pulled up. No entourage, no dramatic pause, just a door opening and a tall figure stepping onto the curb. He wore a navy blazer, crisp white shirt, no tie. His silver hair caught the California light, but his face gave nothing away. He nodded to the driver, then walked straight through the side entrance, ignoring the shouts of fans and photographers alike. Inside, the room hushed as he entered through a side door. No announcement, no fanfare. He simply appeared near the stage, exchanged a quiet word with the event coordinator, and took his seat without fanfare. The audience shifted, some leaning forward, others glancing at their phones to confirm he was really there. Cameras zoomed in. The live stream viewership ticked upward. He looked older, of course. Time doesn't spare anyone. But his presence hadn't dimmed. There was a stillness about him, a kind of quiet certainty that made the room feel smaller, more intimate, even with 50 people watching. He didn't scan the crowd for approval or flash a practiced smile. He just sat, hands resting on his knees, eyes steady. The moderator stepped up to the mic, welcomed everyone, and briefly introduced the occasion. A conversation about storytelling, legacy, and what it means to make something that lasts. Then came the Q&A. Hands shot up. The first few questions were softballs, about his early days in Hollywood, favorite collaborators, memories from iconic sets. He answered each with the same unhurried tone, never rushing, never performing. He told a short story about shooting a scene in the rain with no cover, how the crew just kept going because that's what you did back then. It wasn't romanticized, it was just fact. Then it was her turn. The reporter raised her hand, and when the moderator pointed to her, she stood. Her pulse tapped in her throat, but her voice came out smooth, practiced. She smiled as she spoke, just enough to seem friendly, not enough to seem mocking. "You've said recently that modern films rely too much on effects and not enough on real human moments," she began. "But isn't that just nostalgia? I mean, audiences today love immersive experiences, big visuals, dynamic pacing. Shouldn't cinema grow with the times instead of looking back? She let the question hang, her tone light, almost playful. A few people chuckled softly, as if to say, "Yeah, fair point." Others stayed silent, watching him closely. The reporter sat back down, crossing her legs, waiting. She expected a rehearsed answer, maybe a polite deflection. What she didn't expect was the silence that followed. He didn't answer right away. He looked at her, not with anger, not with condescension, but with the kind of attention that made you feel seen, not judged. The room seemed to hold its breath. Even the camera operators slowed their pans. Outside, the city noise faded into the background. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, calm, and carried without effort to every corner of the room. "I'm not against change," he said. "I've changed plenty myself." He paused, letting that settle. "But tools don't tell stories, people do. And if you lose sight of the person in front of the camera, if you stop caring whether their silence means something, then all the technology in the world won't save you." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. "You can build a whole world on a screen, but can you make someone feel lonely in it? Can you make them believe a character's tired or scared or in love, just by the way they look at a coffee cup? That's not about the era. That's about honesty." The reporter's smile had vanished. She stared at her notebook, not writing, just listening. Around her, the room stayed quiet. No one clapped, no one interrupted. It wasn't a performance. It was a conversation. And for the first time that day, it felt real. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't quote statistics or name-drop directors. He just spoke like someone who'd spent decades watching people, studying silence, understanding that the smallest gestures often carry the loudest truths. And, in that moment, the line between past and present blurred, not because he was stuck in the old ways, but because he reminded everyone that some things never go out of style: truth, respect, and the courage to speak plainly. As the moderator moved to the next question, the reporter stayed still, her earlier certainty replaced by something quieter. Curiosity, maybe, or even humility. She realized she'd come to challenge a legend, but what she got instead was a lesson that real strength isn't in winning an argument, but in making someone think twice without ever raising your voice. And outside, the sun finally broke through the haze, casting long shadows across the red carpet, light and dark, just like any good story. The room stayed quiet for a beat too long after his answer, not the kind of silence that feels awkward, but the kind that settles in when something true has just been said, something that lands deeper than sound. The reporter sat back in her chair, fingers resting lightly on her notebook, not writing anything down. She hadn't expected that. Not the calmness, not the clarity, and certainly not the way his words seemed to hang in the air like they belonged there. Like they'd always been part of the room. She'd rehearsed her question a dozen different ways that morning, testing the tone in the mirror, making sure it sounded sharp but not cruel, skeptical but not dismissive. She wanted to challenge the idea that today's cinema was somehow lesser, because to her, it wasn't. She'd grown up with films that used digital sets, motion capture, and layered sound design to tell stories that felt just as human as anything shot on grainy film decades ago. To her, calling that empty felt like calling her generation's dreams shallow. So when she asked her question, she'd let a small laugh slip in. Not to mock, she told herself, but to ease the tension. A little levity, she thought, would keep things from getting too heavy. But now, sitting there, she realized her laugh hadn't eased anything. It had done the opposite. It had drawn a line between then and now, between him and her, and she suddenly wondered if that line was necessary at all. Around her, others shifted in their seats. A film student near the front scribbled furiously in a journal. A veteran critic in the back row gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their shots a little longer, as if sensing this moment mattered more than the usual promotional banter. The moderator, sensing the shift, tried to lighten the mood. "Well, that's certainly something to think about," he said with a chuckle, glancing at his notes. "Next question?" But before he could call on anyone else, the reporter raised her hand again. This time she didn't stand. She just lifted it slightly, like she wasn't sure she should. When the moderator nodded, she spoke. Quieter this time, no smile, no laugh. I guess what I'm really asking, she said, choosing her words carefully, is whether you think there's room for both. For the old way and the new? Because I've seen films that use every digital trick in the book and still make me cry. Still make me feel like I know the characters. Isn't that possible? He looked at her for a long moment. Not with impatience, not with pity, but with the kind of attention you give someone when you believe they're genuinely trying to understand. Of course it's possible, he said. I never said it wasn't. He leaned back slightly, his voice still calm but firmer now. What I said was, the tools don't matter if the heart's not there. You can shoot on an iPhone or $1 million camera. If the story's hollow, it stays hollow. And you can shoot on a soundstage built in 1940 or one that exists only in code. If the actor's lying, the audience knows. He paused, then added, I've seen young directors do incredible things with nothing but a phone and a good idea. And I've seen big studios spend hundreds of millions on something that feels like a theme park ride with dialogue. It's not about the year or the gear. It's about whether you care more about the story or the noise around it. A few people nodded. Someone in the second row whispered, That's it exactly. The reporter swallowed. She thought about the last film she'd reviewed. A sci-fi epic with zero practical effects, all digital worlds and synthetic skies. She'd loved it. Not just for the visuals, but because the lead character's grief over losing her brother felt so raw, so real. She'd cried in the theater. And yet she realized now that wasn't because of the effects. It was because the writer had spent months interviewing people who'd lost siblings, because the actor had visited hospice centers to understand that kind of quiet sorrow. The tech had served the truth, not the other way around. I think I get what you're saying, she admitted, her voice softer now. But sometimes it feels like people hear old school and assume you're against everything new. He gave a small shrug. Maybe I haven't always said it right, but I'm not against new. I'm just for real. That phrase, I'm just for real, stuck in the room like smoke after a match is blown out. Simple, unadorned, impossible to argue with. Later, during a short break, she found herself standing near the coffee table, stirring cream into a cup she didn't really want. A fellow journalist sidled up beside her. You handled that well, he said quietly. Most people would have doubled down or gotten defensive. She shook her head. I didn't handle anything, I just listened, and that was the strange part. In an industry where everyone's trying to be heard, where hot takes and viral clips rule, she'd forgotten how powerful it could be to simply listen. Not to wait for your turn to speak, but to actually hear what someone's saying. Back on stage, the conversation moved on, to film preservation, to mentoring young directors, to the joy of working with actors who show up ready, not just famous, but the energy in the room had changed. It wasn't just a press event anymore. It felt like a reminder that storytelling at its core is a human act. It's about connection, not perfection, about honesty, not hype. As the session wrapped up, the reporter packed her things slowly. She didn't rush to file her piece or check her phone for notifications. For once, she wasn't thinking about angles or clicks or how to frame the story for maximum engagement. She was thinking about the weight of a silence, the honesty in a glance, and how easy it is to mistake style for substance. Outside, the afternoon sun warmed the pavement. People milled about, chatting, laughing, snapping photos. But inside her, something had shifted. She hadn't come to be taught a lesson. She'd come to ask a question. But sometimes the best answers aren't the ones you expect. They're the ones that make you rethink why you asked in the first place. And as she walked back to her car, notebook tucked under her arm, she knew one thing for sure. She wouldn't be writing a snarky headline about outdated views. She'd be writing about what it means to care, really care, about the stories we tell, no matter how we tell them. The moment didn't explode, it settled, like dust after a door slams or the quiet that follows a deep breath held too long. No one clapped. No one shouted. Even the usual rustle of papers and murmured side comments faded into stillness. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but full, packed with something unspoken that everyone in the room suddenly understood. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't called her out by name or twisted her words into something ugly. He'd just answered, plain and steady, like he was talking to a neighbor over a fence, not a reporter on a stage with cameras rolling. And that was what made it land so hard. There was no performance in it, No rehearsed zinger, no dramatic pause for effect. Just truth offered without armor. The reporter sat frozen, not from embarrassment, but from recognition. She'd asked her question expecting a debate, maybe even a clash of generations. Instead, she got something rarer: clarity. And it wasn't the kind that made her feel small. It was the kind that made her feel seen. Not as a critic, not as a voice for the new, but as someone who also cared about stories, even if she'd forgotten how to say it without sounding defensive. Around her, people exchanged glances. A young filmmaker in the third row wiped his eyes quickly, pretending to adjust his glasses. An older journalist, someone who'd covered Hollywood since the 80s, gave a slow nod, like he'd just heard something he'd been waiting decades to hear said out loud. Even the publicist in the corner, usually glued to her phone, had stopped scrolling and was just watching. Her expression unreadable but soft. Then, almost gently, "He added something more, you know," he said, his voice still low. "I've made plenty of mistakes. Films that didn't work. Lines that fell flat. Scenes I wish I'd shot differently. But the ones that lasted, the ones people still talk about, they weren't the fanciest. They were the ones where everyone on set believed in the same thing, that this moment mattered. Not because of the budget or the star, but because it felt true." He looked around the room, not with pride, but with something closer to gratitude. And that's still possible today. Maybe more than ever. Because now anyone with a phone and an idea can tell a story. The door's wide open. But if you walk through it just to make noise, well, noise fades. The words hung there, not as a warning, but as an invitation. The reporter finally looked up from her lap. Her earlier smirk was gone, replaced by something quieter, thoughtfulness, maybe even humility. She realized now that her laugh hadn't been harmless. It had been a shield. A way to keep distance between herself and a perspective she didn't fully understand. But distance doesn't lead to understanding. Listening does. She thought about the interviews she'd done before this one, how often she'd framed questions to confirm what she already believed, how she'd edited clips to fit a narrative, how she'd let trends dictate what was relevant. She loved film, truly. But somewhere along the way, she'd started measuring its worth by metrics, views, likes, box office numbers, instead of moments. The kind of moments that stay with you long after the credits roll. The glance that says everything. The silence that speaks louder than dialogue. The ache in a character's voice when they say, "I'm fine," and you know they're not. Those moments didn't need CGI, they needed courage. The courage to be still. To be honest. To trust that the audience is smart enough to feel what isn't said. As the Q&A continued, she didn't ask another question. She just listened. Really listened. Not for a soundbite, not for a quote to drop into a headline, but for the rhythm beneath the words, the care, the history, the respect for the craft that ran through everything he said. Later, during a short break, she stepped outside for air. The California sun was warm, the sky clear. A few fans still lingered behind the velvet ropes, hoping for a glimpse. She leaned against the theater wall, breathing in the mix of exhaust and eucalyptus, her mind racing not with angles or takes, but with memories. She remembered the first movie that made her cry, not because it was sad, but because it felt like it knew her. She remembered staying up all night as a teenager, writing short scripts, not for fame, but because she had stories bubbling inside her that needed out. Back then, it wasn't about being right or modern or ahead of the curve. It was about connection. She pulled out her phone not to check notifications, but to open her notes app. She typed a single line. Truth doesn't need volume. It just needs space to be heard. Inside, the event was wrapping up. People stood, gathered their things, exchanged quiet words. When he walked off stage, there was no grand exit, just a nod to the moderator, a handshake with a crew member, and then he disappeared through the side door, as quietly as he'd arrived. But the room didn't empty quickly. People lingered, talking in low voices, sharing thoughts, asking each other, "Did you hear what he said about silence? Or remember that film he mentioned? I haven't thought about it in years." It wasn't just about him. It was about what he'd reminded them of, that storytelling at its best is a shared human experience. Not a competition. Not a trend. Not a weapon. Back at her desk later that evening, the reporter stared at her blank document. The usual template, hook, quote, analysis felt wrong. Too slick, too fast. This moment deserved more than a recap. It deserved reflection. So she started over. Not with a headline, but with a question. What if we stopped measuring stories by how loud they are and started listening to how deeply they land? She wrote slowly, carefully, choosing words not for impact but for honesty. She didn't call him a legend. She didn't paint herself as the fool who got schooled. She just told what happened, the laugh, the silence, the reply, the shift. And in doing so, she found something she hadn't expected. Her own voice, clearer than it had been in years. Because sometimes being shut down isn't about losing. It's about waking up. And in that quiet theater, surrounded by strangers who all loved stories in their own way, she hadn't been silenced. She'd been invited back in. The clip spread faster than anyone expected, not because it was flashy or dramatic, but because it felt rare, like catching a glimpse of something real in a world full of rehearsed reactions and polished personas. Within hours, people were sharing it across social feeds, not with outrage or mockery, but with quiet admiration. "Watch how he doesn't raise his voice," one caption read. "This is what respect sounds like," said another. Even those who disagreed with his views on filmmaking found themselves nodding at the way he held his ground. Calm, clear, and without needing to win. But behind the screens and the shares, something quieter was happening. The reporter didn't rush to publish her piece the night of the event. She sat with it. She replayed the recording. Not just his words, but the silence after. The way the room changed, the shift in her own chest when she realized she'd been talking more than listening. For days, she kept her notes open on her laptop, rewriting sentences, deleting them, starting over. She wasn't chasing clicks. She was trying to be honest. When her article finally went live 3 days later, it wasn't what her editors expected. There was no snark, no legend versus modern media framing, no manufactured tension. Instead, she wrote about the weight of a pause, the courage it takes to speak plainly, and how easy it is to mistake confidence for arrogance when you're not ready to hear the truth. She admitted her own assumptions, not to shame herself, but to show how quickly we build walls when we think someone's dismissing our world, when really, they might just be asking us to look deeper. Readers responded in ways she hadn't anticipated. Emails poured in, not angry ones, but thoughtful ones. A high school teacher wrote that she'd shown the clip to her film class, and they'd spent an entire period discussing what truth in the eyes really meant. A young screenwriter shared how the exchange reminded him why he started writing in the first place. Not to chase trends, but to say something only he could say. Even a few veteran directors reached out not to praise the legend, but to thank her for capturing a moment that felt human in an industry that often forgets how to be. Meanwhile, the man at the center of it all stayed quiet. He didn't post about it, didn't give follow-up interviews dissecting the exchange. He simply went back to work, editing footage in a quiet room, meeting with collaborators, doing what he'd always done, making things that mattered, without needing the world to watch him do it. But the ripple kept moving. At a small indie film festival in Portland, a panel on authentic storytelling in the digital age opened with a screening of the clip. Afterward, the moderator asked the audience, "What if the real rebellion isn't using the latest tech, but choosing to be still?" The room fell into a discussion that lasted long past the scheduled end time. People talked about films that moved them not because of spectacle, but because they felt seen, because someone behind the camera cared enough to get the details right, the way a hand trembles, the way grief sits in the shoulders, the way joy can be quiet too. Back in Los Angeles, a group of film students gathered in a campus lounge, debating whether old-school values could coexist with new tools. One of them pulled up the reporter's article on a projector. "She didn't have to admit she was wrong," someone said. But she did, and that made it real. That honesty became its own kind of currency. In an age where hot takes are currency and outrage drives engagement, choosing humility felt radical. The reporter's piece wasn't the most viral thing online that week, but it was one of the most shared in private messages. In classrooms, in late-night conversations between friends who loved movies and missed the feeling of being moved. Not just entertained. Even the network she worked for noticed. At first, they'd worried the piece was too soft, not punchy enough for their usual tone. But the engagement told a different story. People weren't just reading it, they were talking about it. And that kind of connection, they realized, was worth more than a quick headline. A week after publication, the reporter received a handwritten note in the mail. No return address, just a plain envelope with her name typed neatly on the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 3 lines. "Thank you for listening. Not many do. Keep asking questions, but leave room for the answers to breathe." She didn't need a signature to know who it was from. She pinned the note to the corkboard above her desk, right next to a faded photo of her as a kid holding a camcorder, grinning like she already knew stories were magic. The moment never became a meme. It didn't spawn 1,000 reaction videos or get turned into a motivational poster, and that was part of its power. It stayed human. It stayed quiet. It stayed true. In studios and editing suites across the country, filmmakers began using the phrase, "truth in the eyes," as shorthand, not as a rule, but as a reminder. Before a take, a director might say, "Let's find the truth in the eyes," and the actor would nod, understanding exactly what that meant. It wasn't about crying on cue or delivering a perfect line. It was about letting the moment live, even if it was messy. And slowly, almost invisibly, the conversation shifted. Not overnight, not dramatically, but in small ways. Interviews became less about promoting and more about sharing. Panels focused less on disrupting the industry and more on serving the story. Even marketing teams started using fewer flashy trailers and more intimate behind-the-scenes glimpses that showed the care behind the craft. None of it was because of one man's words alone. But his reply, quiet, steady, unshaken, had opened a door. And people walked through it not because they were told to, but because they remembered something they'd almost forgotten. That stories are meant to connect us, not divide us. That respect isn't outdated, it's essential. And that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is speak softly and mean every word. The reporter kept writing, but now she listened first. She asked fewer leading questions and more open ones. She stopped chasing the gotcha moment and started looking for the human one. And in doing so, she found her work mattered more, not because it was louder, but because it was real. Because in the end, that's what lasts. Not the noise, not the clash, but the quiet moments when someone speaks the truth, and someone else is willing to hear it. Months passed. The buzz around the press event faded, as these things always do. New trailers dropped, new controversies flared, new headlines pushed old ones off the front page. But in certain corners, quiet editing rooms, late-night dorm discussions, film school classrooms, the exchange hadn't been forgotten. It had settled in, not as a viral moment, but as a touchstone, a reminder that storytelling at its heart isn't about spectacle or speed or even success. It's about showing up honestly. One crisp morning in Northern California, a small group of students gathered in a sunlit lecture hall tucked into the hills outside San Francisco. The room smelled of coffee and old books, and the projector hummed softly as it warmed up. They weren't there for a lecture on camera angles or lighting setups. They were there because someone special was visiting, someone who rarely made appearances anymore, but had agreed to speak to this particular class after a mutual friend mentioned how deeply they'd studied his work. He walked in without fanfare, carrying a worn leather satchel and a travel mug. He nodded to the professor, shook a few hands, and took a seat on the edge of the stage, not behind a podium. There were no notes, no slides, no prepared speech. Just him. A room full of curious faces and the kind of quiet that comes when people are genuinely listening. After a short conversation about craft, about patience, about trusting actors, about knowing when to cut a scene, he paused. A student in the front row raised a hand. "Sir," she began, her voice steady but soft. "A lot of us saw that interview, the one where you talked about truth in the eyes. It really stuck with us. We've been wondering, do you ever worry that people only remember the soundbite, not what it really meant?" He didn't answer right away. He looked out the window for a moment, where fog curled around the redwoods in the distance. Then he turned back, his expression thoughtful. "People think silence means you've got nothing to say," he said finally. "Sometimes it just means you're waiting for the right moment to say it." The room absorbed that, not as a quote to screenshot, but as a way of being. He went on, "I've never cared much about being remembered. What matters is whether the work speaks while it's here. A film doesn't have to last forever to matter. It just has to land true for someone, even if it's only one person, even if it's only for a minute." He told them about a letter he'd received years ago from a man who'd watched one of his older films the night his father passed away. The man wrote that a single line, delivered quietly, almost as an afterthought, had given him the courage to say goodbye without shame. "I didn't write that line for him," he said, "but it found him anyway. That's the thing about honesty. It travels farther than you think. The students didn't take notes. They just listened. And in that room, the story of the press event wasn't a clash or a comeback. It was part of a longer conversation, one about respect, about listening, about the courage to speak plainly in a world that often rewards noise over nuance. Later, as the session ended and students lined up to thank him, one young filmmaker hung back. When it was just the two of them, he asked, "Do you think that moment when you answered that reporter changed anything?" He smiled faintly. "I don't know if it changed anything big, but if it made one person think twice before laughing at someone else's truth, then it was worth it." That was the thing no one had expected. The moment didn't end with a mic drop or a viral victory. It ended with reflection, with humility. With people choosing quietly to be better, not because they were shamed, but because they were reminded. Back in the city, the reporter who'd asked the question now taught a short workshop on ethical interviewing. She didn't mention the event by name, but she often told her students, "Your job isn't to prove you're right. It's to understand what's real." She'd learned that the hard way, not through failure but through grace. And online, though the clip still surfaced now and then, it was rarely used to mock or divide. More often it was shared with captions like, "This is how you disagree with dignity," or "Sometimes the quietest answers hit the hardest." It had become less about who said what and more about how we treat each other when we don't see eye to eye. Years from now, film historians might not list this exchange among the great cinematic moments. It won't be in textbooks or documentaries, but in the lives of those who were there or who watched it and felt something shift, it will remain. Not as a spectacle, but as a lesson wrapped in stillness. Because real dialogue doesn't happen when we shout louder. It happens when we lean in, when we stop performing and start listening, when we realize that someone else's truth doesn't threaten ours, it might just deepen it. And that's the kind of story that doesn't need special effects, a famous name, or even a perfect ending. It just needs two people, a moment of honesty, and the courage to let silence speak. As the sun dipped behind the hills that afternoon, casting long golden shadows across the campus, the students walked back to their dorms not with hot takes, but with questions, good ones, human ones, the kind that don't demand answers right away, but linger, like the echo of a voice that chose kindness over cleverness. And somewhere, in a quiet room far from cameras and crowds, the man who'd spoken so plainly that day poured himself a cup of coffee, opened a script, and got back to work, doing what he'd always done. Not for fame or legacy, but because the story still mattered. Because in the end, that's all any of us are really trying to do, tell the truth as best we can, while there's still time to be heard.